Excellent timing. Welcome, everybody. We're here, and we're once again doing the Onion. What is the state of the Onion? And the Onion this week is, of course, mathematics, or as they say in this country, maths, or as they say in another country, math. And as the kids would say, though, the math ain't mathin'. I have no idea. It's just a bastardization of the language, but I don't care. I'm joined with Piper, Headless Chicken, Floyd, Mark Reed, Hogtie Champ, Gus, and Cerberus, of course. And this week, as I say, we're going to be talking about, does one, as in the person, invent or discover math? So that's where we're going to go to. No Xbox at the moment, but I do hope that he will be in soon. I'm going to post the link out there as well soon. But in the meantime, I want to hand it over to somebody who would like to take first dibs at this and introduce what is meant by what does one invent or discover math. Who would like to explain that for me? One of you?
Yeah. So, okay. So, I mean, the quick. When you say when is one, you're presupposing math already. Just no, I'm joking. Look, so things we that aren't in nature or natural or pre-existing already, we invent, and things that are pre-existing in nature or real already or natural, we discover. So does that mean that math is a integral part of sort of reality? Does it mean that it's a natural law, or does it mean that we created something to describe reality? I fall in the camp of that maths is just a language. It describes real things, but it's not sort of real itself. It's just a language that we use, a logical language. So I would certainly come down on the side that we invented maths, we didn't discover it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Floyd, did you put up a little thing? Do you want me to share it?
Oh, yeah.
I'm happy to share stuff.
Okay, I'm not sure if you saw that or not, but...
yeah, I was just waiting for Mark to do his thing.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it's a few, like, the question is mathematical objects, do they exist? For example, does the number 3 exist? Does geometric relationships exist, and so forth? And there's a debate among philosophers. This has been going on for centuries. Do abstract objects exist in general, or universals? And you could be a Platonist about mathematical objects, that the number 3 actually exists in some sort of ontic Platonic realm. But you could be a nominalist and say, no, they don't really exist. There might be instances of the number 3. There might be 3 apples on the table, but the number 3 itself doesn't exist. And you might have some sort of
question. If you had an entire presentation, why did I go first? Sorry, Floyd, keep going, mate.
It's not planned, Mark. Please don't. It's me. What can I say?
I'll explain this diagram. And a middle ground is called moderate realism. It's an Aristotle view that universals do exist, but they exist only within the particulars. This chart that you see here actually got from William Lane Craig, believe it or not. Interesting. And it kind of lays out the popular theories of mathematical objects, what philosophers believe. So if you look on the left-hand side, you have a position that they actually exist. That's called realism. And you could say they exist as an abstract object or actually a concrete object, and so forth. And there's different views. As abstract object, it would just be, Platonism. that they exist in some Platonic realm. I don't know too many people who actually think like math is concrete, but I guess you could view it that way. It's not too popular. Some Christians and theists and so forth, particularly like presuppositionalists, will go for a concept called divine conceptualism, that these concepts exist within the mind of God. So so God created the universe, and He created it logically and mathematically and so forth. So all these ideas, reside in the mind of God. And over the other side, on the right-hand side, is anti-realism, that mathematical objects don't exist at all. And there's a whole bunch of different positions concerning that. Usually, positions called nominalism, where again you could have 3 apples on the table. You can have particulars, but you really don't have any universals. They're just a label for what we give them. We see 3 apples. Well, that's just a label. That's describing the set. But can we say a set actually exists? Well, it has meaning. So yeah, I agree with Mark that no, that they really don't exist. They have meaning, but they don't really exist. And we can think of other examples. Think of unicorns or Darth Vader or the present King of France, right? Those things don't exist, right? But they have meaning, right? We understand what they can mean, even though they don't exist. So I think math is the same way. Math has meaning. We use it, right? We use it every day. But do they actually exist? No, I don't think so. I don't think they do. So just because something has meaning, it doesn't imply that it actually has to exist. So that's my view. And by the way, this chart is from William Lane Craig. He is actually in regards to mathematical objects, he's actually an anti-realist, believe it or not. Years ago, he kind of held to divine conceptualism. But he's actually, he holds to a position which he calls neutralism, which is nominalism. Another term for it is called deflationary nominalism, where, again, it has meaning, but they don't really exist. But you can see all the options that one can choose as far as this topic is concerned, and this topic has been debated among philosophers for centuries and centuries and centuries, and it still goes on. There are actually some mathematicians that are mathematical Platonists, believe it or not, today. So this is not a cut and dry issue, and it's not a subtle issue at all. So I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Who's next up? Who'd like to be next up on that? Is there anything further to add to? I mean, you say deflationary.
Actually,
go ahead.
Now that you've gone, Floyd, I'm glad I don't have to follow that up, mate. So I'm glad I talked first, actually. So I'm going to change my position on that. Maybe if we've got a bit of time, you can run us through the differences between some of those, like it's sort of small, those little endpoints there, because I'm not sure I understand what some of them are, like sort of Neoplatonism or Platonism and things like that, but maybe run us through what some of those designators are would be fantastic.
I'll pull it up again.
Okay.
Well, I guess are you more interested like in nominalism or more on the realist side?
Well, obviously, created absolute creationism. Understand uncreated, sort of the idea that they're sort of Platonism.
Yeah. Okay. So, the idea is that mathematics actually was created. So you could say, for example, that God actually created math, right? So math itself is a created thing. That's not too popular, right? Because like God exists, right? And he's one God, right? So how could God create the number one if he already exists as one being?
But if he's
do you see the problem there? If you subscribe
Yeah.
to absolute creationism, so I don't think too many people hold to absolute creationism.
And the question is,
and the same thing can be said about logic. Presuppositionalists will claim, oh, God, God grounds logic. For there to be logic, there has to be God, right? Well, I think it's the same problem. Well, God exists, right? And does he have an identity? Well,
yes.
Yes. So did God create the law of identity? No. Just the fact that God exists as an identity exemplifies the law of identity. So you don't need
Means
God.
the law of identity must pre-exist God in order for God to exist as an have an identity.
Right.
Well, you could also say that God coming into existence created the law of identity.
Right, but you could think of a possible world where a rock exists, right? And that rock
Sure.
has an identity, so you could say the same thing about a rock, right?
Yeah.
Anything that exists as an identity, right? So, is God necessary for the law of identity? No, I just brought up counterexamples.
But the real question is, if God created math, is that invented, or are we talking about did anybody invent math, or are we talking about did humans invent math? Because if it does one invent, so I think the question's flawed, Simos. Because if one invent or discover math, if it's God, does God invent or discover math?
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
I could flesh that out a little. I would say that the underpinnings of math exist in nature, but since math is a human language, we sort of discover, but also mold it to our own human understanding. So, in that sense, we adapt it.
Well, let's go to the base thing, because obviously the base of maths is numbers, right? So the numbers exist in nature.
Well, no.
I think I'm an anti-realist, so I don't think that they exist.
Yeah.
Well,
But I mean, I've heard it described as sort of a pseudo concrete before, sort of so, which is kind of a weird way to describe something. But I mean, I would fall down the anti-realist side, but I don't know. There's something there that sort of, the number 2 doesn't exist, but 2 can be applied to things, and there's something concrete about having 2 of something as opposed to something else, right? It's not a subjective thing.
It's not subjective, but I'd say it's arbitrary. Really, all that we have is one or nothing. If we start gathering ones together, then we can make additional items, but we choose to group them together. We could just say there are a whole bunch of ones.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, okay. I think there are 2 issues which I'd like to talk about really here, which is so arithmetic is one, clearly. But then, when we consider arithmetic, I guess, and Hogtay, I'm kind of getting you in here, if I may, which is to say that obviously the operations plus the numbers or the units themselves, I prefer to use the word units here, obviously then constitute something much larger in terms of, that's what gives us the numbers. But then there are more abstract ideas on top of that, such as infinity and zero. So when we say invented or discovered, I think this is where the heart of it becomes. I think we can all say that the language itself is an invention of humankind. But then, even then, can we say that nothing is invented? Does that even make sense as a sentence? I'm not sure. And then can we say infinity is invented? Right? Because therefore, clearly the concept of infinity itself can be split into potential infinities or actual infinities. And we're not even sure whether actual infinities can really exist or not. So it's a whole new minefield then when we start expanding what we mean by math. Okay.
Well, it's weird.
go ahead.
Like, how does nothing exist?
Well, I think you're gonna find some of these weird boundaries where at a certain level or a certain level of investigation into mathematics, you're going to be comfortable with a viewpoint. So, for example, nominalism or even Platonism, right? It actually kind of makes sense to talk about a realm where the number 2 exists and where triangles exist. Or even with nominalism, it makes sense. Well, we have labels for these things. It makes sense. Like if we're going to say things that the statement 2 + 3 = 5, that statement, it's a proposition and it has a truth value. It's either true or it's false. And I'm comfortable with that. Well, how do we assess those things? Well, if I had 2 sheep and I had 3 sheep, then it's true that I have 5 sheep, right? We actually are making statements that can be assessed as true and false. And it's very, very comforting. So you can say, well, the number 2 is real because I can picture 2 sheep. The number 3 is real because I can picture 3 apples. This is sort of what lends to the realism. And then you mentioned operation. Like I can picture having 2 sheep and 3 sheep and then bringing them together. And then now I have 5 sheep. So not just the numbers are real, but the operation of addition and equality, those things are something meaningful. Okay, good. We're all comfortable with this. Yeah, hey, what about the square root of -1? So I mean, we can envision, so like the number 4, we can picture some number that when you square that number, you end up with 4. Well, that would be the number 2. But we also picture a number that when you square it, its square is the number -1. And now how does that map onto how many sheep you have in the field or how many apples you have? So, I mean, this would be my question for other people too. And it kind of goes like this, and I want in the audience to whatever extent you think the number 3, like Floyd was talking about the number 3 being a thing, being something that quote unquote exists. Okay, cool. To whatever extent you think the number 3 exists, do you think the square root of -1 exists? Do they exist? Do they both those numbers exist or neither exist? Or does the number 3 exist in a way that the square root of -1 doesn't exist?
I'm going to say the numbers exist if sets exist.
Well, then do sets exist?
Yeah.
No, and this really is going to take us to the issue. But what do we mean when we say something exists?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, the number 3 exists, or the square root of -1 exists, or addition exists, or morality, quote unquote, exists. Good thing, bad thing, do those things, quote unquote, exist? What does that mean to say something exists?
Well, I mean, obviously, and I sort of thought that we sort of designated as sort of a concrete or sort of. I suppose that's not true because on the diagram there we had sort of concrete and abstracts within real things. So, yeah, so that's a good question. What does exist actually mean?
Okay.
Well, I did hear some message mentioned. I don't remember who said it. Was it Floyd? But somebody said, well, I think it was Floyd had said, well, we can imagine. So when we do a lot of philosophy discussion takes place when we talk about worlds, and a world doesn't mean like an alternate dimension. It means like we're just a set of propositions are the case. And Floyd said, well, we can envision and even discuss a world in which there's one object that exists. It's a rock, or it's a proton, whatever, and nothing else exists. In case minds don't exist. And I think, and I'm not going to answer this for myself yet, but I think it's an instructive question. If there was a universe where the only thing that existed was a single proton, does the number 1 exist in that universe? Does addition exist in that universe? Does morality exist in that universe? So I would instructive to make a comparison about a world we're discussing that does have minds that are capable of contemplation and of concepts versus another imagined universe where there literally are no minds. The entire universe is mind independent.
See, in that example, I think the universe is a set, but it's a set of 1. So to ask if the the proton exists is to ask if the universe exists.
Well, perhaps we can get more general and talk about abstract objects. Can we? I guess I don't know if anyone would disagree that like mathematics or mathematical objects are abstract, not concrete. Would anyone disagree with that comment? With that position that math is abstract?
I'm not sure. It's possible that. Well, this is why I asked the question about sets, because if sets exist, then I think numbers are properties of sets, and then sets are both abstract and would both be abstract and concrete. There are real things that are sets, and then there are abstract things that are sets.
Yeah, I don't think sets are sort of concrete, though. I think that they're an abstraction. There's no reason behind sort of a subjective means that we have to group these things together. We kind of apply labels to things and then group them via those labels. I don't think there's anything real about sets.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, would you say the universe is real?
Yeah.
Would you say that it's the mereological sum of all things?
No.
Do you think there are things outside the universe?
Maybe. I don't know. Sure.
Okay. How about just to include possibility? How about, do you think the let me put it, the multiverse exists?
I don't know.
I don't know. Well, that's where I am on this topic.
Can I bring up something which I think probably stems from Bertrand Russell, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
So there is that, which is to say that there are properties of these abstract objects, mathematical objects, which have labels which we would, I guess, think exist. An example of this would be something like a triangle having the internal angles that add up to 180 degrees. Okay, now I guess we'd expect that to be the case. Well, let's just say a square, actually. Let's use square because it's a simpler example for me. So we would say that a square has 4 angles which add up to 360 degrees, which is the definition of a flat plane. A circle in a flat plane has 360 degrees. So we'd expect that to be the case. The properties of the square adding up to 360 degrees, when it comes around to a line comes around to itself, we would expect that then to equate to the same, to those objects, in effect, wouldn't we? Right. So those two properties seem to be existent not just in the abstract, but also by definition in reality as well. So does that alter what we think as being real, or does that give some kind of weight to a particular type of abstractor?
Well, that's not
being existent.
That's not technically true, because you're talking about perfect squares and perfect circles, which I don't think
Well, they don't have to be
exist.
perfect. I mean, they if you draw out any kind of square, even in an approximate form, it's still going to have all of the angles adding up to 360 degrees.
I'm just remembering. I might be wrong on this, and I totally, will concede if I'm wrong, but I do remember doing sort of calc for the first time, and that there's no such thing as a straight line. Every line is a curved line. Like there is no, so when we're putting a line on sort of paper as a straight line, it's a curve with a sort of arc of 0. Right. So
yes,
the way that you think about, or the way that I was introduced to think about calculus was forget about straight lines don't exist. Right. They're not a thing that happens in reality. Like they're just always curved. Just the curvature we sort of project as 0, but that's never the case in reality. So there isn't a sort of as a sort of extension of that. I mean, we all know about the perfect circle. There's no such thing in reality as a perfect circle. It's always going to come out slightly oblong, because when you keep homing in on it, there's always room for that deviation from the perfect circle. But also a square, it's not technically using straight lines in reality. It's always going to be, because the same thing, when you keep homing in, that line is going to be curved eventually. I don't know if there's a way around that. It's possible that when you get down sort of molecular levels and stuff, it's just possible, but I'm not too sure about that. I just, the way that I was taught about math is that there are no such things in reality as straight line. We kind of make that up in our head to describe things.
Well, I think, I mean, generally sets are example of an object, of an abstract object. I mean, usually, you know, we think of examples of abstract objects, propositions, numbers, sets usually comes to mind. Those are usually the typical examples given of an abstract object. And I guess we can talk about characteristics of an abstract object. I think the view is that they exist if you can say they exist at all. If they did exist, they would exist outside of time and space, you know, like a Platonic form. They have no causal effect. They don't cause anything. The number 3 doesn't cause anything. Some would say it's necessary that the concept could abide in all possible worlds, and that it's universal. You know, there'd be nowhere where the number 3, you know, couldn't apply. And perhaps you could say the concept of these abstract objects is in the mental realm, and then we can get into, oh well, if it's a mental realm and they exist, well, doesn't that require some sort of necessary mind? And if it requires a necessary mind, well, what's a necessary mind? What's an absolute necessary mind? Oh, God. So therefore, if math exists necessarily, then God must exist necessarily. So that's an argument that we've heard from apologists, right?
Well, for me, I'll say that thing that you just mentioned about what I call causal potency. When I try to decide whether something, quote unquote, is real or whether it exists, whatever that might mean, I take a bit of a pragmatic view, and that is to say that something exists if there's any potential for it having causal potency, right? So I can be in a field somewhere and there can be a horse running towards me, and therefore in my mind I hold a concept of a horse, right? That's a conceptual thing, and I also have a concept of a unicorn. But the concept of a unicorn is causally inert, whereas a horse running at me, that concept is tied to a thing that actually does exist. So in my view, neither of those concepts actually exist because they're causally inert, whereas the physical horse is something that has at least some potential consequence. And by that same sort of reasoning, this is why I say, and I'm saying for years, like I'm a what you might call a numeric or a mathematical fictionalist. I hear some people use the term anti-realist, but I don't believe any of it exists. I think the number 2 is just as, quote unquote, imaginary as the square root of -7, because the number 2 or the number 3 or the number square root of -7, those things are all causally inert. I guess let me ask you this: what is the difference between the number 3 existing in some Platonic realm or existing as a concept versus it not existing at all? Or what does it mean to say something? How is it different to say something exists outside of space and time versus it just doesn't exist at all? Like how are these things even meaningful?
Yeah, that's what Plato brought up. Plato is kind of like the founder of Platonism, right? So he brought it up, but he was aware of the problem of forms. What role does these universal forms actually play? Some say, oh, it's required. Like if you see a horse and another horse, you couldn't be able to identify a horse unless the universal of horseness exists. But the problem with universal forms is that it creates an infinite regress. Well, how do you identify the form of hoarseness unless you have some sort of meta form? And then how you identify that metaform, and then how you identify that meta-metaform. This is known as the third man problem. It creates an infinite regress. So what role does forms actually play in identifying a horse or a set of three things or any classification of anything? And I argue that they don't play any role at all, or they're not necessary. How does a universal form actually apply to particulars? And how does having to know about these forms gives us any ability to identify, a horse or a chair or anything? I just don't see any role that they can necessarily play, and if they did exist, so I just don't think they're necessary. And again, I definitely lean towards nominalism. I just don't think Platonic forms offers anything.
Okay,
And it's weird because I've heard that before, and sort of when you said the chair, that brought up sort of an argument that I had with somebody, and I sort of said, well, if you've got a tree stump, that may be a chair to one person, but not to another. Like, what do we actually call? So when we look at the list of all the things that are chairs, to say somebody's never seen an ergonomic chair before, right? You've seen ergonomic chairs; they're the ones that you kind of kneel on. They're kind of weird. They were big in the 90s, I think. Sort of that's a chair to some people, but if someone unfamiliar, they wouldn't know what it is. So what is this? I don't know how we'd access that Platonic ideal. I don't know how we'd confirm that actually exists somewhere. I'm very confused by the idea of Platonic ideals. I don't know why we would appeal to them. Sorry, go ahead.
I was rolling around what Hogtie said in my head, and I was wondering if he thought a law or laws have this causal property that he thinks like a horse has.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, like when we have like either scientific laws or even logical laws, I mean, in my view, those things are all
like legal laws.
Legal laws, yeah.
Oh, well, then I'm not really sure what you're asking, because I mean, I don't think. I mean, boy, that's a different thing, because it's so unfortunate we use the word law in such a very, very different way, because the laws kind of refer to like rules of conduct, right? And okay, I don't think they exist either. Again, for me, a big part of the acid test is whether that thing could be said to exist in a universe without minds, right? So in a universe without minds, does it make sense to discuss a prohibition? Remember laws, when we talk about the law, so there's a law against murder, it's a prohibition against murder, and all it is a if-then statement, something of consequences. If you murder somebody, then the appropriate punishment is you go to jail for 5 years or whatever. I'm oversimplifying. If you drive faster than whatever speed, then you get a $50 ticket. These are things that we write down where one mind is a set of minds is communicating to the rest of the minds. Hey, these are our preferences. We would prefer that you didn't drive faster than 55 miles per hour. And we're so dedicated to that. If you do so, we'll give you a $50 ticket. Right? I mean, that I don't know what it means to say that those things exist. Especially, I think it'd be impossible to consider them as existing in any sort of a concrete form, because can these preferences and these directed consequences, can they exist in a universe without minds? So with that being kind of my acid test, I would say no, it's not really sensible to discuss them as existing meaningful in any sense.
Okay, a couple things. I'm not sure if that's a good test, because minds are real. And preferences, if you're saying they're preferences are like a property of mind, something minds contain. So if you're going to look at see if a property like that's real, you wouldn't look at it as if in a universe where there is no mind, that you're assuming an answer at that point. But I think they cause things. Wouldn't you? It'll be preferences, if you just want to say preferences.
No, I don't think they cause things. I think they're descriptions of state. Even to say things like use the classic thing everybody used to say in Google Hangouts, but I prefer chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream. That we have words that we use, and I don't even know if this borders on nominalism, but these are words that we use for conversational convenience to describe not a thing out there, but kind of a set of circumstances, like the hypothetical notion that if you sat me down and said, "Hey, we have only two types of ice cream, and you're allowed to have only one scoop of one of them," well then the state of affairs in those circumstances are I would choose the chocolate, right? Well, we just described that by saying I like chocolate ice cream, and it's the same thing when you have these rules about speed limits or not murdering people, or even expressing moral preferences about what should be done or what shouldn't be done. These are, or when you talk about, well, this person hates that person, or this other person is in love with this other person. These are all just conversational conveniences that describe the complex state of affairs of a bunch of interaction. And I think they remain causally inert.
So you wouldn't say that your preferences causes you to want and try to achieve your preferences?
Right. I would not say that. I would say that when we describe a preference or even ponder our own preferences, it's not the preference that's causing us to do those things. The preference, as stated, is just our label, our naming of that state of affairs, that I hold this preference over this other thing.
Well, I would say now we can use your test and just remove preferences. Now, do you still eat the chocolate ice cream?
Well, I think the state of affairs still exists, whether or not that preference is ever contemplated. The underlying state of affairs exists. And if I can touch back on your earlier point about how, maybe I was trying to point out how bizarre it is to discuss things like preferences or laws or rules in a mind-independent reality. You're like, well, I wouldn't even know how to contemplate that stuff in a mind-independent reality. This is why I would say things like morals, for example, don't exist in a mind-independent fashion. Because
I would say morals are preferences too.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Morals are another statement of preferences. And just by the way, before some nutter gets here and goes, those atheists are saying that morals are nothing more than whims and preferences. No, they are preferences. There may be principles that guide our establishment of preferences or our documenting of preferences. But at the end of the day, yeah, that's what they are. Rules are rules, and laws are ways of coding our desires or preferences or whatever. And why I say those things don't exist is because you can't engage in moral contemplation if there are no minds in that world. You also can't engage in mathematical contemplation in a world where there are no minds, which is why I say all this stuff is fictional.
Yeah, but I guess getting back on topic though, like if I say I like ice cream, that's purely subjective, because who's this in that sentence? What is the subject? I am, right? So I'm saying something about myself rather than the ice cream. Or if I say I like chocolate, I'm saying something about myself. I'm not saying anything about chocolate. I'm saying I like chocolate. I'm the subject of that sentence, right? So, so that's a preference. But if I say something like there are 3 apples on the table, right? I'm not saying anything about myself at that point. It's not subjective. And in fact, if there are 3 apples on the table, that's an objective feature of reality, right? That there's 3 apples on the table, and I don't have to exist or be in the room, for those 3 apples to be there. So I guess so I think we would all agree that those 3 apples exist. But again, we're back to, well, does the set of those 3 apples exist, and do they exist as a concrete or an abstract object, and can we say they exist at all? But there seems to be a fact of the matter that there's 3 apples there, right? But
I think, if I can, I think that's a good wedge illustration of the sort of distinction that I'm drawing out here, is that if I'm in a room and I'm looking at the 3 apples, there's lots of contemplations I can have. I can see that there's an apple, and there's an apple, and there's an apple. I can also contemplate the notion that there are 3 apples. I can contemplate the notion that there's 2 apples, and then there's another apple, and the 2 apples added to the 1 apple equates to 3 apples. So now I've got addition and equating and I can contemplate the deliciousness of them, right? But when I leave the room and I take my mind with me, where my mind was never aware of those apples, all of a sudden now there's a whole bunch of stuff that isn't in the room. Yes, mind independent. There is an apple, and there's an apple, and there's an apple. But absent from the room is 3. When I left the room, 3 left the room. There's an apple, and there's an apple, and an apple. You say, well, there's still 3 apples there? Well, yeah, there's 3 apples there. But is the 3 still in the room? No, it isn't. The addition isn't in the room, and the deliciousness isn't in the room. Those are all subjective, they're targets of contemplation, not anything in physical reality, I would say.
Yeah, but if and this is going to be sort of devil's advocate because I don't, I'm also a fictionalist, but like if the 3 leaves the room when you leave the room, that means the an apple leaves the room also, right? You don't get to have, one, but you don't get to have 1 in the absence of 3 if you're saying that there's no numbers without people there.
Yeah, I should have mentioned too also the idea that there's not only in the room there are 3 apples, but there's also one set, a set of 3 apples, right? There's also the set of 2 apples that are on the west end of the table, and the set of apples on the east end of the table contains 1 member. Then there's the union set of the 2 that contains those 2 sets. I'm saying all that stuff, even the concept of apple, leaves the room. Even though the apples are still there, the concept of apple leaves with me, is what I would suggest.
Right. I'm just going to throw a possible wrench and sort of say, well, there's also the set of molecules belonging to those apples in the room as well.
I think we have.
Okay, well, okay, sure. Okay, but what if it isn't an apple? What if it isn't another apple? What if it's actually so somebody swept the floor, and before you get the dustpan, you sort of have these little piles. So now there's a pile of dust, and another pile of dust on the west end of the kitchen, and a pile of dust on the east end of the kitchen. Well, now we have a pile of dust and a pile of dust and a pile of dust. We also have a set of 2 piles and a set of 1 pile of dust. And we have the addition of 2 piles plus 1 pile is 3 piles of dust. Well, what if whatever, some force comes along and splits one of the pile, like makes a line through one of the piles? So now is the pile still a pile, or is it 2 piles? You know what I mean? Like all of this stuff, in my view, is completely made up.
Well, again, let's say those 3 apples fell from a tree, and then the table is outside. It's a picnic table, right? So that's not something that we did, right? But it's still an accurate state of affairs of what's going on. I think we need to distinguish between 2 things, and I'm actually kind of stealing this view from Ozzy, that there's the human use or application of language, mathematics, logic, so forth, and then there's the verities which are described by the language. Clearly the use and application of it is language dependent, which requires a mind, which human agents simply have. But what the language describes can be mind independent, right? And again, it doesn't have to actually exist to have meaning. For example, let's go back to a unicorn, a fictional creature, the unicorn. The concept of a unicorn can only exist in the mind, right? The concept, only exists in the mind, and so concepts are mental acts. But what the concept refers to is not a mental act. It's not a concept. The concept of a unicorn is a concept, and that requires a mind. That's in your head, right? But a unicorn itself is not a concept. Well, if unicorn is not a concept and it doesn't exist, well, what is it? Well, a unicorn is a horse-like creature that has a horn out of its head. This creature just simply doesn't exist. But that doesn't mean that unicorns don't have meaning. Unicorns don't exist, but they still have meaning. And again, a unicorn is not a concept. A unicorn is an animal a horse-like animal with a horn out of its head, even though it doesn't exist. So again, I would say numbers and math and so forth has meaning, but they don't necessarily have to exist, with any, in any optic realm.
Oh, Nick.
Welcome, Nick.
Hello. Thank you.
Have you been listening in? And would you like to?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, just about.
all right.
You're a little quiet, but have you been
all
listening?
right.
And would you like to pontificate for us, please?
Well, no, I have not been listening. I just got home, so I came home,
problem.
dove right in. So I heard Floyd speaking, and from what I've heard so far, he seems to be making a lot of sense. So I don't have anything else to say.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Okay.
Just shut up.
That's okay. That's okay.
So well, I'd argue a unicorn. The definition of a unicorn would also necessarily entail it's a fictional. That was my only gripe from what I heard. So I got in it. A unicorn.
Right. Yeah.
It is not a horse-like creature with a horn. It is a fictional or mythical horse-like creature with a. But that's a minor. Other than that, I agree with what I heard. But I just got.
Well, yeah. I said unicorns don't actually exist, but a unicorn is an animal, though, right?
No.
It's not an animal?
No, it's a representation of an animal.
I disagree. It's a representation of an animal. It's a fictitious. If you
Are
were to
we
look
going
it
to
up
be
as a
doing
dictionary,
unicorn taxonomy here? Is that what we're seriously doing?
Well, I think you guys probably were on genuinely important topics until I showed up. I have showed up, and now we are going to get into the taxonomy of unicorns. Yes, Mark.
Okay.
I think I've lowered the bar for everybody.
When I brought that up in a debate once, someone said, "No, they do exist. They're rhinoceroses."
Yeah, that's because apparently there's a thing about the Bible unicorn being, a description of a rhinoceros, and so they sort of go with that. But,
Yeah.
I think, can if we say, can we define something as an animal kind of thing? Can we make that definition, Nick? Can we say, hey, if a unicorn existed, it would be an animal. It would carry all the traits that we associate with because we have a list of things that define an animal in science, right? We can say, hey, this is an animal as opposed to a plant or a virus or whatever.
Yes, yes, I agree.
So why couldn't we, by definition, give that unicorn a label of animal?
Because it isn't an animal. If you can find a unicorn that is an animal, then you would succeed. Now, you can find a unicorn that is a character in a work of art. You can find a unicorn that is referenced in literature. You can find all of these things. You cannot find a unicorn that exists. And since all animals, as part of, I think, being an animal, the second you say being an animal,
that's fair. Okay.
It entails existence.
Yeah, sure.
I've never seen.
Well, I don't think
I've never seen an existing unicorn. Therefore, unicorns. That sounds like a black swan fallacy to me.
Yeah, just because there aren't current.
I am open to the fact that they may exist, but since I've seen neither any compelling evidence to believe that they should, I usually argue that they don't. But if you want to sit here and say that I cannot say for certain that they don't, I would concur with that statement. But I also don't think it's productive to assume that
I would say by definition unicorns don't exist. I think when we say unicorn, I think everyone in their mind thinks a fictional thing. Unicorn doesn't exist. And if we happen to one day to stumble across a unicorn, I mean, didn't they have a unicorn in in a circus? What was the popular circus that closed? Ringling Brothers, right?
Yeah.
Didn't they have a
let's go for a different one. Let's go for a different one. Let's go for fairies, because there's people out there that think fairies do actually, in fact, exist. So let's go for fairies.
Yeah. Hold on, before we get to that, I'm going to suggest we're actually we're starting to detect we're headed we're headed toward the famously philosophical rocky shore. So let me ask this question real quick, and I'll see how treacherous our path is here. Is Peter Parker a human? Whatever you think of Peter Parker is part of his characteristics. Is he classified as a human being?
Mostly.
It depends on the characteristics. Sorry, it depends on the context. Like most, so if I were to say, is this person innocent? If we're talking sort of every day, we're talking about this person innocent, we may say somebody's innocent, but in a legal context, we might actually mean something very, very different. If we were to say, okay, what theory, for example, okay, theory is a word that means something very different colloquially than it does under other contexts, such as in science. So when you say, is Peter Parker human? If I was speaking with somebody in at a comic book store, I would have a different answer to that question than if a scientist came up to me and said, "Is Peter Parker human?" I would answer that question differently. Yes, I absolutely
No, you wouldn't.
would.
No, you wouldn't, because the answer is both the same. Mostly, Peter Parker is mostly human, right? But one of the things about the universe Peter Parker lives in is that it is that a great deal of padding, a great deal of structure was created around the concept of mutation, which essentially just means X number percent of you is human, and there's a little bit extra thrown in there, and it's the little bit extra that.
I think we're splitting hairs here.
No, I don't.
We're not only splitting hairs. No, we're talking past.
I don't think we are, and I don't think we are, and I don't think we are. And thank you kindly.
Yeah,
I think when you got those two sets of people, the definition that they would both give, and they would both be talking about the same thing, and it would both be the same definition. He is mostly human.
Oh, hold on. No, because I took your question differently, and you don't actually know how I'd answer, and I've had that kind of discussion before. So let me ask you a question, Gus. Is there such a thing as a human being who does not exist?
Is there such a thing as a... Sure.
There is. So when I say human being, that does not entail existence.
Well,
give me an example of a human being who exists. Does not exist. Give me an example of a human being who does not exist.
One way you can parse it out is
the current king of France doesn't exist.
And the current king of France is human, though.
Sure.
There is a human...
By hypothesis, the current king of France, if there was a king of France, would be a human being.
If there was,
there's no king of France.
Is there a human being that does not exist? So they would have to both be human and not exist. If the answer to that is no, which I suspect it is, and I'm willing to argue, then Peter Parker is not human, period. So if I was talking to a scientist, and the scientist came up to me and said, is Peter Parker human? I'd say no, because he's fictional. There's no such thing as someone who is both human, actually a living, breathing human, and fictional. You can't have both in the same thing. Well, if I was at a comic book convention, I'd say, yes, he's human.
But I think it's context. I think it's context specific. So Peter Parker is human in the context of that fictional story, right? So you're talking about but if you're talking about is he human in the context of the real world, then no. So correct. I think you can actually give two answers to that.
And that's what I said. Which is why I would give two separate answers based on the context. That is exactly what I said.
And the class of human, and you can break down the class of human into fictional humans and non-fictional humans, right? And Peter Parker would fall into the class of fictional humans, but that's a subset of the class of human. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. Right?
So
I think you
can I stop you there? Can I stop you there just to ask? Are we just arguing over what existence means again?
I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Well, I said fictional representation, and someone had a problem with that.
We're going to spend most of this hangout doing that, by the way.
That's the essence of it.
This is largely ontological. I agree.
Well, maybe we will. But if you could put your thing back up, Floyd, I'd appreciate that as well.
I don't need to see the thing. I appreciate it.
But would anyone say that Peter Parker exists?
Yeah.
So there's
you would.
Obviously, but,
as a fictional representation of a human.
He didn't say as a fictional. He said, "Does Peter Parker exist?" He did not add the caveat.
He does exist.
Well,
he does
exist. Thing is,
he also didn't say, "Okay, we're all talking over each other. I'd like to answer." Yes, he exists as a fictional representation. If he had asked, "Does he exist as a real, living, breathing human being?" I would say no.
But what if he just said yes or no? Does he exist?
Yes.
I think that's an interesting perspective. I think it's a defensible perspective. I don't agree with it, but I do think it's defensible.
I think it depends on the sense in which you're asking. Depends on the sense in which you're asking. There's a philosophical issue about, in fact, do fictional entities exist in some sense, right? because if we can talk about fictional entities, but they just aren't a thing, right? How can we talk about them, right?
And Peter,
so
Peter,
you can give different answers to that question, but personally, I think it depends on the sense in which you ask. So if you ask me, is there Peter Parker a character in a fictional story? I would say yes, that exists. Is Peter Parker a real human being? No, right? Or a real person? No, or a real entity? No.
But you asked a very basic question: does he exist? And
but
I believe the answer to that question is truthfully yes.
But as soon as you say
question,
was that Hogtie?
I think the question to which a point was to arise was, is Peter Parker human? Was the question.
Right, but that's not the question that was actually asked a minute ago.
That's literally what the question was. Okay,
that was not Mark Reed's question.
No, Hogtie, the question that was asked a minute ago.
We're talking past
it. Does he exist?
Correct. There were two questions. The second most previous was, is he human? The most previous one was Mark Reed's question, does he exist? So it is correct that the most recent question was, does he exist? That was the most recent question.
Can I get a second here? Gus, why does Peter Parker exist?
Because someone wrote about him.
That was a great imitation of my voice.
Oh, he said Gus. I'm sorry. I heard guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, would you agree with that though, Gus? Because he's someone written about him.
Because he was created, and he succeeded in that creation, and he endures.
Okay.
So as far as I'm creating, even if he doesn't endure, he still would have existed.
Okay,
so what
Gus.
separates Peter Parker from
This is a two-part. This is a two-part. Sorry, Gus. Does God exist?
No.
Yeah.
Why? He's written about.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Mm-hmm.
That's it.
You just said, wait. So Peter Parker exists, but God does not. Yet both are written about. In fact, a lot more people have written about God than Peter Parker, and more people have seen him.
That's fantastic. But then again, Peter Parker doesn't ask anybody to have faith in his existence. He publishes.
Okay, so
the people who have put him out into the world publish several books once a month, whereas God's a bit of a different story. God says, "Believe in me," and that's about that.
Does that change whether he exists or not?
Yep.
So wait. So existence is based on what some character says, not on what, because they're both identical in terms of how they've been instantiated in the universe.
You can't boil this down past what I've said, Nick. I'm sorry.
Why not?
Just can't. Some things are greater than the sum of their parts.
So this is well. So here's look. As soon as you say he when referring to Peter Parker, you're necessarily sort of instantiating that it's a thing. I agree that Peter Parker exists in the sense that somebody created him and as a work of literature. But if you're not permitted to say that, normally when somebody says does something exist, what they mean is it real? Is there a tangible way of interacting with it? Now, the literature of Peter Parker all exists, the comic books exist, and Peter Parker exists as, and you have to have this caveat, exists as a piece of literature or a fictional character. But if you do not have that caveat, and if the question is, does he exist, yes or no, the answer must necessarily be no, because there's no way of interacting with Peter Parker. You can interact with the comics that show him, you can interact with people who are fans, but you cannot interact with Peter Parker because Peter Parker does not actually exist. The concept exists, but he does not.
That is a set of scaffolding that would have to be insane to disagree with you with it. The only thing I would mention is that none of that was woven into the first question I was asked about Peter Parker.
Okay. I got a second question. If the next issue of Spider-Man has Spider-Man looking at the audience and telling them to believe he's real, would he cease to exist then?
Well, at that point, my faith would have to be tested, wouldn't it?
What faith?
My faith would have to be tested.
Faith in what? I'm sorry. The question, as I understand it, was if Spider-Man or Peter Parker looks at the audience and says, "Believe in me," your answer was, "My faith would be tested." Your faith in God, your faith in Peter Parker, your faith in comic books. I don't understand.
Really?
Your faith in what?
Really? So if Peter Parker's looking at me, my faith in God would be tested, Nick? Come on.
I don't know. I'm asking a question. I'm asking faith in what? You said my faith would be tested, and I don't know if it's your faith in God, faith in Peter Parker, faith in comic books. You said my faith. Which faith? I'm asking for you to elucidate, please, because I don't understand your answer.
I apologize for you not understanding my answer. I do not possess the capacity to elucidate beyond what I've already done.
Okay, so your faith. Okay, so I'm not. I unfortunately don't understand the answer, but that's all right. Plenty of things I don't understand. We'll add one to the list. It's a big list.
So just to try to recapitulate and move us back to where we were about mathematics, if that's possible. So existence. We're back to. I thought this was basically just about existence. What exists, what doesn't. If we say something abstract exists, we have a different meaning to the phrase something actually exists. I'm going to use the word actual here because it relates here to infinity. Okay, so actual infinities potentially don't exist, maybe, whereas potential infinities or infinities in the abstract infinities potentially do exist as mathematical objects. Does anybody disagree with making this distinction and using the word exists for both types? Hogtie, I think you might, if you're a fictionalist.
Hang on, sorry. I had my earbuds out for the last few minutes. I was talking to my wife. So what was the question?
Don't blame you. Okay, so the word existence, okay, it could be as. Do you object to that word being used with abstractia? So such things as sets, fictional characters, and general mathematical objects.
Yeah, I don't think abstract objects do exist. I mean, there are many abstract objects. You can think of truth, acceleration, economics. All those things are abstract. Numbers, sets, propositions. I wouldn't say that they don't exist obviously as concrete objects. I described how concrete objects are different than abstract objects. So to say they exist, they certainly don't exist as concrete objects exist.
Correct. Yeah.
But I think instead of using the word exists, perhaps we can use the word abides. So I don't think truth exists. Well, what do you mean, Freud? Things aren't true? No, things are true. But I would say truth abides. I don't say truth actually exists. Truth actually abides. And what does it abide in? It abides in the actual state of affairs of that proposition refers to. If I say 3 apples are on the table, the 3 apples are on the table is not true. That is the truth maker. The proposition that there are 3 apples on the table, that is what's true. The proposition I just uttered is true. That's the truth. The proposition is the truth bearer, and that has the truth value, not the actual 3 apples on the table, if that makes sense.
Well, what's the distinction between existing and abiding?
Again, existence has some sort of ontological status, where abiding it doesn't.
So when we say truth abides, what we're just saying is something like we can assign correct truth values to propositions, and so there's not, it's not something that commits us to ontological baggage.
That there's some sort of correspondence, yeah.
Okay. Well, but so if there's correspondence, presumably then there's a relation, right? And if there's a relation, that sounds like there's an entity that exists.
Well, again, I don't think something has to exist for it to have meaning. Again, we brought up examples of a unicorn or the current king of France, right? Current king of France doesn't exist, but that has meaning, right?
Right.
So
just check the private chat.
So for something to have meaning, and it refers to something, that something does not have to exist for it to have meaning.
Check the private chat for the King of France, by the way. But this now leads me on to the question which I'd like to ask, which is, so could you tell me the distinction between something which exists that points to something which is concrete and something that exists, and I'm using this word exists here, maybe incorrectly, but I'm going to use it anyway, and something that exists in a fictional sense, which is made up as a made up concept, right? So like something that points to something in reality as opposed to something which points to something which is a
I
concept.
mean, I think the basic thing to say is that fictional entities are sort of entities that are sort of merely kind of mental. They don't they don't refer to anything outside of the minds of human beings, presumably. Whereas concepts that refer to things that do exist, right, are picking out things in the world. Now that's kind of simple, right? And so if you kind of analyze it further, you might be able to find sort of difficulties with it. But, I think that's probably the baseline where most people will start in trying to answer that question. But
I guess to get back on topic, is math something made up, or is it something that we discovered? I'll come up with a new question, kind of, that's related. The question is, are the truths of mathematics merely a function of our brains and language? I guess that's a question that we need to answer. Is addition and so forth, geometry, algebra, calculus, that's something that's merely in our brains or in language, or does the truth of those things, reside outside of our mere mental concepts?
No, I'd say it is contingent upon what we're able to observe.
Right. So when we see three apples on the table, a lot of truths can come from that, right? The one apple plus the two apple equals the three apples, right?
Yeah.
And the three apples is a set of apples, and you could probably go on and on and on of all the truths that exist with those three apples just being on the table, right? You could bring up logic that those three apples exist as identity, so you have a law of identity applying to those apples, and one apple is not the other apple, and so forth. So you have the law of excluded middle and non-contradiction and all those things. So you can come up with many true propositions from just the fact that there's three apples there on the table, right?
Just from observing it, yes.
Right. So, and again, we would say that those propositions that we form are true, but we wouldn't say what those propositions refer to are true. Right? But what they refer to are still external from our minds, right? They're still external from our brains, right? We're not making it up, right?
Well, that's why I want to know, because some are and some aren't.
I guess the question: are we the truth makers?
Hang on a minute, Floyd. What do you call the ones that do relate to things which are external to our mind, as opposed to the ones which are not external to our mind? What is the difference between those two? How do you label them differently?
Well, I think we brought up the example of Peter Parker, right? That came from the mind of Stan Lee.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't come from our mind, right?
But it came from a human mind, right?
Right.
So I'm talking about what are the things which actually relate to things in the reality, concrete things, as opposed to things which don't relate to concrete things. What words do you use to describe those which are different? How do you make that distinction?
Well, they're both nouns, right? Do we distinguish them?
And I'm not asking for things which make them the same. I'm asking for things that make them different.
Well, I mean, one thing that describe them as different is one we say is abstract, the other we say is concrete, right? That's one.
No. That can't be the case. That can't be the case, because when we say apple, that is a concrete object. If I point at an apple, I'm pointing at an apple which really exists, right? Now the apple might be a concrete might be an abstract concept. Okay, because it could be that I'm talking about an apple in Superman or something, or Spider-Man. I think it is, isn't it? Right. So
Well-
how do I distinguish between those two things? Right.
Well-
In other words, there are sets, mathematical objects, which do refer to which refer to reality. There are mathematical objects which potentially may not refer to reality. That's another can of worms right there. But so what is the difference between these two? In the landscape of mathematics, how do we distinguish between what points
Well,
to reality and which doesn't?
Well, with in regards to an apple, a particular apple, we would consider a concrete particular, right?
Yeah.
But apple in general is an abstract universal. Same thing with dog. A particular dog would say, I don't know, Fido would be a concrete particular, and then
Right.
and then kind of this dog in general class.
Yeah, well, what about pluralizing
be
it
an
then?
abstract
Yeah,
universal.
I get you. What about pluralizing it and saying dogs?
Well, again, I would say you have a tennis match, right, or a group of dogs, right?
Mhm.
That could still be considered. Well, I guess that's interesting because if you have a group of dogs, that's a set, right? So that
Yeah.
would be considered abstract, right?
Okay. So is there a difference between when we refer to dogs as a concrete thing and dogs when they're not a concrete thing? Is there a distinction to be made there?
Well, I think when we start to eliminate measurement, when we start eliminating accidental properties, and measurements of things, we come up with kind of like a general concept of what a dog is, right?
Could it be argued that the question of a dog and or what its physical properties are is exclusively a ontological question, and that the problem is when we try to view more epistemological questions in ontological terms? So could we frame math as either a description of an ontological reality, but really that description is a search for what we can say is true about that object, which is actually an epistemological question, not a question on the nature of that thing. So it's when, and I'm kind of verbal processing here, and then taking out the what you're calling the abstract and saying that these are questions that we are putting into a more epistemological, what makes it this? How do we claim this? And how do we measure this versus the ontology of the existence of that physical thing, which is not a concept? Because truth itself, truth with a capital T, which is the subject of ontology, is already, not ontology, sorry, of epistemology, is already much more of a concept than anything that we can say exists. And if we try to take a ontological approach to capital T truth, we end up in trouble very quickly. So say, okay, these abstract concepts, you're really talking about epistemological problems. And as soon as you frame it in an ontological framework, all of a sudden, that's where we have these problems, and that's what's going on here.
Yeah. But would we say that mathematics only applies to the actual world? I don't think that's correct, right? Just like the laws of logic and the laws of mathematics would apply
But
to
that's what makes
all possible worlds, even fictional
which is what makes
worlds.
which is what would make then math, and then I don't know, I think I'm going to get into trouble here, but that would be why the mathematics would actually be an epistemological. We're trying to figure out mathematically deduce a set of laws for determining truth, for determining reality. So it's epistemological. Math is epistemological, not ontological.
So actually, I mean, I don't think we've got into the actual like arguments for realism about math, and I think this is actually a good point to sort of get into them, because it's actually the fact that math applies to the world in some way, seems like, that then leads people to argue that it's real, right? So the fact that it's such a useful epistemic tool leads people to believe that it actually has some ontology, right?
Here we go.
And in fact, so I mean, there are a couple different arguments. I think an interesting one to bring up here might be the indispensability argument, because I mean, maybe a lot of us, I think I have this proclivity, but maybe a lot of us who don't want to believe in those things kind of don't want to believe in them because they're not exactly they're not exactly like natural kinds or like properties that are directly like investigatable by the scientific method, and maybe we want to only believe in those things. I mean, that's my sort of bias, I guess. But the indispensability argument is an argument that since mathematics is part of scientific theories, you should believe in mathematical objects. So, the idea is you should believe in those objects which are contained in successful scientific theories. Successful scientific theories contain mathematical objects, so you should believe in mathematical objects.
So essentially, if I understand correctly, because we believe in the objects of science, that in and of itself instantiates mathematics.
Correct, according to the argument, if the argument's successful.
That makes sense. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, when I say that makes sense, I mean I
you
understand the argument.
reasoning. Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Okay, then does that take us to a place where it makes sense to talk about the usefulness and therefore the realness of things like the numbers 2 or 7, even 3.5. 3.5 is something meaningful to talk about because we can see application to it. But then numbers like the square root of -1 or the square root of -7, the square root of -13, plus 4, those are things that therefore can be relegated to not existing. Is that kind of how you look at it?
Well, and there are things that that we know don't exist, but for the sake of an argument or because it makes illustrating a point easier, we assume for a moment does exist, or we operate as if it exists. And I know everyone's going to shoot me as soon as I say this. Hume's problem of induction. We assume there's an answer to it because it's useful, despite the fact that we cannot rationally justify induction. Induction is still useful and productive nonetheless, so we use it despite not having a rational justification for it.
A priori justification. Okay. Just before you go, Hogtie, sorry, I'd say you go, Nick. I didn't mean you go. Because I was thinking, now he said that, I'm going to have to get him out of the hangout. But no, I'm not. I'm not. Hogtie, mathematical landscape. I just want to come back to that. Then we're going to go to Freud, if we may. But if you could just talk to me about the different versions of mathematical landscapes applying to reality and not applying to reality, and if that has a bearing on the question.
Well, that's what I wanted to explore. I wanted to explore that issue of applicability and indispensability. Because it's what I'm really excited about, and it's for this reason. And that you heard me much earlier in the conversation talk about this apparent boundary between the real numbers and the imaginary numbers. And boy, I got to put like quotation marks around quotation marks. So just for clarity, there's, and again, most everybody here knows this, but like the real numbers are anything you can find on a number line, whether it's 0 or 4 or 3.5 or the square root of 2. Which has an infinite number of decimal places, or the transcendental numbers like pi that you can't construct by putting together exponents and fractions and stuff. Those things are all real. But then the so-called imaginary numbers are the ones that exist. So you got your number line, and then like weirdly above and below it, like off the number line, there's a whole bunch of numbers that are some function of the square root of -1. And by name, we call one set the real numbers and the other set imaginary numbers. Complex numbers or combinations that include an imaginary component. And I've always been fast distinction because the implication is the real numbers are real and the imaginary numbers are just imaginary. And it's always been my view that one number is as real as the next. One number is completely imaginary and conceptual as the next. And it's because of this applicability. So I would suggest actually it'd be helpful if we stick on this topic for a minute, because that before I give my answer to it, I sort of want to give what I think the is that, like, imagine that you knew somebody who Just says, I don't believe in odd numbers. I don't like them. I don't use them. I don't think they're real. The even numbers are real. Look, I have 2 cows. I have 2 more cows. Now I have 4 cows. I believe in the real number, or those numbers that actually exist, just the even number. You would find that the odd numbers are indispensable. You couldn't do business with this person, because if there were a day that, you know, you needed to I'm trying to think of an example now, but you want to, there are circumstances then that an odd number would come up. I should have done it the other way. If he doesn't believe in even numbers, and if you have to
sell 2, if you have 2 cows, you want to keep one because you need the milk, but you have to sell the other because you need the money. You can't do business with the guy.
Right, but yeah, you're right. Because then, what does it mean to keep one? Because he doesn't know. Well, actually, let me, at the risk of throwing a wrench in this, let's turn it around. He doesn't believe in even numbers, right? So you have 3 cows and he has 3 cows, and you go to put your cows together in the same pasture. Well, now you have how many cows? The number of cows you have is a number that doesn't exist, and now we can't sensibly communicate about the number of cows because you don't believe in even numbers. So that's the indispensability argument. So we can't do away with odd numbers. We can't do away with prime numbers. We can't do away with square numbers. There's just a whole bunch of that wouldn't exist. When I say math wouldn't exist, what I mean is the notion that this type of language is indispensable. I love that word for it. We cannot do business to cattle or money or splitting up a pizza. We cannot do this stuff without the rational numbers. What does it mean to eat 3/8 of a pizza if you don't believe in rational numbers? But, and I'm going to pause on this point because I don't want to just talk for 20 minutes, but I hope we stick on this topic for a second. Things like the square root of -1 or the square root of -7 with 3 added onto it. These are things that we can't discuss because we don't believe that those numbers are real. They're just imaginary numbers, and they are dispensable. We can do away with worrying ourselves about the square root of -7. So we'll talk about those other numbers, the rational numbers and even the transcendentals as being real, because they're indispensable in our conversation about physical reality. But the square root of -1 is dispensable. So can I pause on that point for a sec just to gather thoughts from other people in the room? Then I'll tell you why in a moment.
Yeah, I'd like to go to Floyd, if I may. Floyd, could you expand that on your screen so we can see it a little more clearly?
Let me see if I can make it bigger.
Excellent, that's perfect.
There you go.
Okay, so as to what Hogtie was saying.
So yeah, so I mean, here's kind of like a set of all the numbers that I guess mathematicians have come up with, and and how brought up the square root of -1, which is an imaginary number, and so forth. But imaginary numbers are actually used, right? I think they're actually used, like in quantum physics, for example. So it's not something like some quirk, that just came up, from a function of the square root, for example. I think imaginary numbers are actually used. So how do we understand that? I mean, it kind of makes things even more complex, right?
Chuckle there because you referred to complex numbers, right? And even this, I'm glad you found this illustration because the point I'm illustrating, and again, I sort of jogged through set theory very, very quickly because I assume most people here remember that. This is actually even high school level stuff, but you notice there's like they give all these different sets, but there's a very, very clear distinction between that big right-hand bubble and that little left-hand bubble off to the side because who cares? So yeah, the natural numbers are for counting, and then the whole numbers include 0. Integers include negation. That comes in handy. It makes sense to say I have -$3 because I owe somebody $3. Rational numbers can be done by division. There's the why is real? Oh yeah, 0 times I. Never mind. The real numbers, that whole set, including the irrational numbers, those numbers that can't be constructed with a ratio, like the square root of 2. But they should even include a subset of the irrational numbers. That's the transcendental number. They can't be constructed with any combination of exponents and fractions. The square root of 2 you can construct. 2 put up to the power of 1 divided by 2 will give you the square root of 2. But the the base of the natural logarithm, you'll never find it. Pi, you'll never find it using any sort of rational, any sort of like algebra type expression. So even in that little irrational bubble, there's some weird numbers in there. And all that stuff is interesting. But those numbers off to the side, those imaginary numbers, that stuff doesn't matter to most people. But Floyd's absolutely right about this. So this is actually Floyd's ushering me to my point here, is that to whatever extent those real numbers are important for understanding the reality of selling cattle or wheat or whatever, when you discussed the reality of like physical reality, like the very fabric of reality itself, quantum mechanics, particle motion, like when you actually discuss the literal fabric of physical reality, it turns out the square root of 1 is indispensable. It's not a mere convenience that makes some calculations a little more convenient. It's literally in the same way that it would be impossible to discuss the number of cattle you have with somebody who doesn't believe in prime numbers. It would be impossible to have a discussion about the literal fabric of reality if you don't believe in the square root of -1. So you see that and Floyd kind of takes me to my point, and you guys just what I want to ask you and ponder this. Let me know what you think. So if that's the case, when did the square root of -1, quote unquote, start existing? Because it was totally, the indispensability criterion, right? The number 4 was indispensable for a very long time. The square root of -1, we've never needed it. Oh, but now there's a day when it turns out that the most fundamental things we can discuss about reality, it turns out the square root of -1 is indispensable. Is that the day that the square root of -1 started existing?
Let me ask a question before getting into that, which is it possible for a thing to not exist and yet be indispensable? Because you're assuming that that's not possible. To ask your question, you're assuming that that's not possible. And you might be right. I don't know, but that's the first thing that I think of is it possible that a thing does not exist and is yet indispensable? Does that make sense?
And that's a great question. That's a great question. I want others to answer it. That's the key question I'm raising. Yes.
Okay. Could you put that link, Floyd, in the private chat for me so I can put it in description later? Thank you.
Or actually, rather than staving it off, I'll just, a little less mystery here. I think that all of the numbers, whether they're counting numbers or they're fractions or they're irrational numbers or transcendentals or even the unreal, the imaginary numbers, the complex numbers, I think all of them have that exact property that I think embedded in the next question. And that is, let me turn it around the other way. Just because something is useful, does that necessarily mean the thing exists?
Yeah, that was the better way. Yep.
Yeah. Well, because that's the thing. Well, that's I think that's how I think we get into this trap of believing that the number 3 exists and the square root of -3 doesn't exist. That's how I think we fall into the trap. We say, well, I find the number 3 useful in my day-to-day living, therefore it must exist. I can't depend on something that doesn't exist. But here's how the numerate fictionalist gets into and out of that problem. You simply say, there's a real world out there. It's full of quarks, and it's full of protons, and it's full of sheep, right? And wheat, and I have to do contemplation about it. And during my contemplation about those concepts, I'm able to conjure other concepts that are useful. 0, 4, addition, the square root of -3. These are all concepts that I'm able to conjure as I contemplate. Some of those concepts turn out to be indispensable, like 3 or the square root of -3. So in the world of my contemplation about reality, there are these concepts that float around and they have rules to how they function. And I find them very useful. In fact, so useful, some of them I'm going to label indispensable. But that doesn't magic wand them into being, quote unquote, part of reality. My answer to the whole question right there.
Well, and I think that's sort of why I said maybe this is more of an epistemological question, right? Because you've just described all of epistemology to the best of my understanding is truth. Does truth actually exist? Well, it's a concept, but is there such a, now we can say what is true by any number of rules and logic and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean it exists. So ontology is dealing with things that we know exist, or either assuming exist or trying to understand what does it mean to exist. But that's not mathematics has actually very little to do with any of that. You can say that 3 plus 3 equals 6, and that is a true statement, but nothing about that statement is ontological in any way. And whether or not that statement exists other than my utterance of that statement is irrelevant to the functionality of that statement. That truth is true regardless of any ontological questions about that statement. Yes, no? Am I disconnected?
yeah.
When everybody gets quiet, I was like, okay, I either said something really stupid, or no, I probably just said something really stupid. But anyways,
Yeah, but I think everything kind of leads back to this chart right here. Now, I guess everyone has to vote. You have to pick one. What is it going to be?
Yeah. Okay. Let's go through that actually, because I think we'll start from the bottom because Hogtie's already announced his position. But if you could just say again what your position is on this chart, Hogtie.
Where would I fit? Let me pull off my glasses because I'm old and I can't see that. Definitely, let's go to the way to the right. I'm sorry, I'm not. I'm going to say first off, I'm not a fan of William Lane Craig's specific breakdown. I think he makes distinctions that aren't relevant. So I normally go Platonist and then nominalist and then fictionalist. I guess on this chart, let's go way to the right. Does not exist, and the rest of it is just gibberish.
So fictionalism, basically.
Fictionalism. Yeah, it does not exist, and then down to fictionalism is probably the best descriptor.
Okay. Nick, how about you?
Does not exist, and I think it would take way too long to try to find a subcategory in that. So I'll just go with Hogtie.
Anti-realism is good for you then. Okay. I'm not sure I know what all these distinctions are, so neither. Fortunately, I'm lost. So there we go. Hillary, how about you?
I'm an anti-realist.
Anti-realist, okay. Cerberus Hex. Oh, he's away. Yeah, he's dodging. He usually does that.
I was going to say he's dodging.
Floyd.
Yeah, anti-realist. Yeah, which one of those subcategories? Yeah, they're all this kind of subtly different from each other. Perhaps like neutralism. That's what William Lane Craig holds to. But I think that's just another name for deflationary nominalism. So I guess I'm some sort of nominalist, but again, I think all these subcategories are just slightly different from each other.
Mm-hmm. Headless.
Don't give a shitivist.
Don't give a shitivist. I've heard of that.
Most popular position on this issue for sure.
Oh, you're like a non-cognitivist or something?
No, I said I'm a don't give a shitivist.
Okay. Piper, please.
Yeah, I'm a fictionalist.
You're a fictionalist as well?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to obviously take a counterpoint. I'm going to say I'm a realist, and I'm a realist in the sense of, I don't know, an abstract realist. I don't know if that makes any difference.
You're Platonist? You're Platonist?
I'm not even sure I know what capital P Platonism is. But let me explain, and then maybe you can tell me where I land. So part of my empiricism includes the models and theories that we use to describe the real world. That's it.
So they're real because by using them, you can't use something that isn't real. So if they're used, they are real.
Yeah. So I guess real in an abstract sense.
Yeah.
So I think because they point at things which are real, like I was trying to get to earlier, then I'd say they're real for that reason. So like Plato's cave example.
There's Aristotle's position called moderate realism, where universals exist, but they only exist within the particulars. Perhaps you hold to that view?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm going to end up, if I talk to you long enough, I will be an anti-realist, because that seems to be the majority view here, and you're all a bit smarter than I am. However, I would just say, that I was trying to get you to answer earlier. What is this difference between within the landscape, right? Some people say that all mathematical objects really exist in terms of they all point to something that exists. Okay, and some people just say, well, there's a percentage of mathematical objects which relate to the real world, and then there are fictional mathematical objects which don't, right? And that seems to be like the more preferable view, or at least the view that I hold. So when I say are mathematical objects real, I think they're real in the sense that they point to real things in the world. At least a percentage of them do.
And here's the problem, of course, which is we think that there should be an answer that is correct on this, but there are multiple answers that are justifiable. So it obviously all hinges on how do you define real? What do you mean by real? The argument that if I interact with it and if it can make predictions, it's real. That is a defensible argument. I don't agree with that argument because I think that if you limit real to that, all the coins of the realm cannot be false. Basically, everything is real. As soon as you've thought of it, it's real. And I think that while that is a defensible argument and that is a defensible view of real, it's not a practical one because you end up with, if everything is real, then there's nothing that isn't real, and then that distinction becomes meaningless. So while I think it's a defensible one, I think it's a common sense one, I don't think it serves any real purpose. So I have a different view, which I also believe is defensible, but not only is mine defensible, it happens to be the one I believe for the following reasons. So the problem is, there's no argument, Simos, that you could make that I would not say that's a defensible argument because it's a defensible position. A person with, a good sort of common sense person could easily agree with that definition. I just have problems with it for other reasons, but it's absolutely a defensible position. I don't hold it for very specific reasons.
Sure. No, I think it's been elucidated by yourself and Hogtie and Floyd and Piper and Hillary as to why it may not be the case or why it's not helpful to draw the distinction where I do. The problem I have is when you draw the distinction where you do, I'm not sure then that allows us to say that there is a sense of discovery, and that I find difficult. That's my stumbling block. Okay, because it seems to me that the usefulness of mathematics in itself is reliant upon the concepts not of arithmetic, but of universal sets almost. I would say infinities. So let's put it the simple way, right? And so without this sense of being able to describe things with in the sense of having unlimited number of divisions in order to be able to accurately describe anything that may or may not exist, right? Then the usefulness, that usefulness that I can't remember who it was that said it. Vigno, was it? Anyway,
indispensability. Yeah.
The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. I think that you lose that, right? Because there seems to be some kind of philosophical or logical barrier which gets crossed there for me. Does that even make sense? I'm not sure it does.
It makes perfect sense. And so what I'm going to suggest is, I think so. We all, I think, balk at the idea that a word could have different meanings under different contexts, and we know some cases. Again, I use the word theory. I'm actually going to use free will for a minute as an example. But the reality is they have to, and the reason is because human beings have a very, very limited intellect compared to a apparently infinite combination of molecules, compositions. What is a table? Well, a table is a billion different possible things. So we have to group them. We necessarily group them. Whether the groups exist or not is immaterial. We cannot comprehend the universe as a whole, so we have to break it down into these chunks. But these chunks are going to have huge swaths of gray areas where the categories that we've established actually no longer work but another category doesn't, and then we're stuck in this gray area. And what we usually do is say, okay, we're going to use a different set of constructs and a different way of even how we define these words in order to operate. So I do not believe there's such a thing as free will. The reason is because I'm a determinist. I don't think we can choose things. Every, quote, choice we make is the sum of all of our experiences, how we process those experiences, and our biology and all of these things. And if I were to go back in time 10 seconds and be given the same choice again, I would come up with the same answer each and every time. And if that's true, I don't think there's free will. But when somebody says, should we punish people who break the law, I say, yes, absolutely. Well, if there's no such thing as free will, how does that work? Well, it doesn't actually help to say there's no free will. When I flip a coin to determine which of my two daughters gets the last bowl of ice cream, the fact that it's not random actually is immaterial for that coin flip. I can call it random, and even though it's not true, the fact that it isn't true is a trivial fact. You can say, well, how can the truth be trivial? In that case, it is. In others, it's not. When you're talking about quantum mechanics, then it's not trivial. But it is for that set of circumstances. So randomness can both exist and not exist depending on the set of circumstances you're using, which also happens with moral theories, right? There are times when utilitarianism is a complete nightmare. Deontology, any of the others could work better, but they don't always work either. So you end up with these gray areas where you say, I'm a deontologist some of the time, but then again, some of the time, and it gets messy. But I think that, so your position is, again, not only defensible, but probably accurate, much more accurate than I think ours under certain circumstances, and finding those circumstances and also being able to have conversations with people who don't use those gray areas to weaponize and to confuse, because that's something that people do in conversations, and right. it gets messy.
Okay. Hogtie, you were about to... I thought of a better way of saying it, but go ahead, Hogtie.
Yeah, I forgot what my thought was there. I know that first thing it was funny as you were taking the poll. I'm surprised that there are this many fictionalists in the room. I've had this conversation before, and sometimes I'm the only one who has to deal with the baffled looks of, wait a minute, you think that there are no numbers or there no triangles don't exist? So I'm kind of surprised and impressed that there are more fictionalists. I did have another thought that was more germane and on topic, but I've kind of lost track of it now.
Okay, well,
one of the first things you said about usefulness.
What I was saying was that I think that the fact that infinities are a mathematical object ensures the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Okay, and I think without that particular mathematical object, right? I think it would all be a happenstance.
I remember
you wouldn't be able to justify. So go ahead.
I remember you'd actually kind of open that point by mentioning about the desire for discovery, and I don't know if this is going to fit in at this point. So probably enough of a gap I can wedge it in. I was actually going to pick on your title a little bit, and the opposition of either math exists and it's something we do discoveries about, or it's entirely conceptual and it's just something. I was going to suggest to you that's not quite an opposition. I think something can be invented and still fertile ground for discovery, right? So remember, and I'm going to lay out what my position is here, and I'll explain what I mean by discovery and why it's still possible to embark in discovery in a completely imaginary world. Remember, as I said several times, I take the position if there were no minds, there would be no 1 or 2 or addition of 1 and 2 to equate to the value of 3. None of this, the square root of -1 being useful in discussing quantum physics. None of this stuff would exist if there weren't minds.
Let me interrupt. But you would say that a table still exists. That's correct. So that's not dependent on mind. And let me rephrase that. Okay, would matter still exist with no minds?
Matter would still exist. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. That's all. Okay, please continue.
Matter.
I want
like those things still exist. Right. Okay, and I think I think earlier somebody used. I mean, table works or chair. You know, if a chair is a thing you sit on, well, then a stump or a rock is a chair as long as somebody's contemplating sitting on it. And you get into the ship of Theseus problem, right? The ship of Theseus is a collection of stuff that's stuck
when you said it wouldn't exist, because there are people who would argue that matter doesn't exist if there's no mind. So when you said math wouldn't exist without a mind, I just wanted to make sure you weren't I just want to make sure going forward I understand your position.
It was idealism, right? We get idealism at that point.
Yeah, so I get it now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think physical reality would still exist, and even if you envision a reality where there's only 3 protons, well, you could look at it from the outside as we contemplate it, say, well, there's 3 protons, or there's one set, 3 protons, or there's 2 and there's 1, and 2 plus 1 equals 3. All that contemplation could happen, but only by virtue of the fact that you're a mind on the outside looking in. But absent a mind, 3 protons would still exist. Of course, in a real world, there's more than 3 protons, but the groupings, things like what we mean by appleness, none of this stuff exists.
Right.
But what was my point about discovery? So what was like, basically every time I make a truth statement, do people get upset when they find, okay, you're a fictionist, so there are no truth statements about math. Is it true that 2 plus 2 equals 4? I'm going to say yes, but that's not the right answer, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4 is not a true statement. It's just a collection of symbols. What I should do, and it gets tedious if you do it every time in conversation. Here's something I say is true. If you're going to adopt the rules of conventional algebra, then 2 plus 2 equals 4 is a true statement. If you want to adopt the rules of conventional algebra, then -4 times -4 is positive 16. Every statement I make about math that I would consider true or false has to be prefaced with, in this conditional world, it is necessarily true that -4 times -4 is positive 16. So let me give you a couple of examples of totally useless things that are subjects of discovery. So I'm going to give you a couple of big. So 7. We know what we mean by a prime number. 7's a prime number. We're all happy with that. 9 isn't a prime number. So let's write down some numbers. Let's take a 10-digit number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Real easy to work with. Is that a prime number? Well, it can't be, because it ends in a 0, so we already know it's going to be divisible by 2, by 5, by 10, and so on. So we had a moment where we didn't know if it was prime, but in an instant we figured it out. How about if we randomize the order? So it's 7, 0, 2, 3, 4, 1, and it ends in a 3. Is that a prime number? Well, it either is a prime number necessarily, or it's necessarily not a prime number. Now, by the way, if you think about it for a second, if you take those digits, 0 through 9, and you add them up, the total is 45. So any number that the digits add up to 45 must be divisible by 3. So therefore, any combination of those numbers 0 through 9, that big 10-digit number, it doesn't matter how you jumble them, you will never construct a prime number. That statement is necessarily true. Most of us didn't know that 20 seconds ago, but now it's something we've discovered. And let's take a number, I'm going to do like a really big number, so let's take 7 nines. So 999, 9999, 37. What is that, 11 digits or 10 digits? 10-digit number. It's a big number. Is that number prime? Well, it's either prime or it's not. And it's not subjectively prime. Objectively, it is the case. And it's not possibly prime. It is, if it's prime, it's necessarily prime. But do you know if it's prime or not? So now you have this unanswered question. Now there has to be an answer, because either it's prime or it's not. And if it is prime, it's necessarily prime, modally necessarily prime. If it's not prime, then it's impossible that it could ever be prime within the rules of the system we're describing. But you, at this minute, still don't know if that's a prime number. So it is something that is open to quote-unquote discovery. So that's why I just want to object to the whole notion about discovery, because something can be completely made up. We can invent something like the game of chess or Sudoku puzzles or the Rubik's Cube or the concept of prime numbers. We've invented all of those things, in fact. And as soon as they're invented, we've created, quote unquote, this fertile world for discovery. Those worlds are fertile for discovery. They don't exist. I don't believe they're real. They're completely conceptual and imaginary, but they are still fertile grounds for discovery. So just because something is imaginary doesn't mean there's no discovery to happen. And on the other side of it, just because we can do discovery doesn't mean the world in which we're working isn't merely conceptual. How do you like them apples?
I like them apples, Ogtai. You've actually answered the infinity question by saying that as well. Because like my biggest problem was, starting with arithmetic, how can we get to infinity? You can't, but yet the concept comes from it. So yeah, in that sense, is it a discovery or is it an invention? Well, it can't be an invention because it was necessarily there with the concept of one and an operation of plus, right? So, but
Yeah,
there's no way when when somebody said, well, 1 + 1 is 2, that they automatically knew that infinity was a mathematical object. I mean, that's
right.
just
Actually,
inconceivable, right?
I'm so relieved that you were able to take all the stuff that I said about like prime numbers, for example, and were able to read in the same sort of pondering about infinity. Because the idea that 999999937 is or isn't prime, this is not a useful fact. There's nothing useful about primes at all. Oh, wait a second. It turns out the Mersenne primes are super important in protecting your bank account information. So now we have a subset of this imaginary toy problem that turns out to be incredibly useful. I don't know if indispensable might be too strong a word, but if you like your bank account information being protected, it turns out it's indispensable. So, and I'm glad you almost read in the notion about infinity, because all that same sort of pondering. So we create this world, and then now we're going to add to our world some contemplation of infinity. And you start realizing things like, well, how many numbers? Well, there's got to be a lot of numbers. There's 1, and there's 2, and there's 3. There's a bunch more. In fact, there's an infinite number after that. Well, how many even numbers are there? Well, there's got to be half as many even numbers as there are numbers. Well, oh, wait a second. So however many even numbers there are, there has to be twice as many natural numbers. Well, it turns out that's not true. It turns out there are exactly many natural numbers as there are even natural numbers, right? Is that a useful fact to you, Simos? I think it's not at all useful. It's interesting as far as it goes, but at this point, nobody knows an application of this. Somebody's going to tell you, well, there actually are bigger. There are more numbers between the numbers 1 and 2 than there are numbers. This doesn't make any sense, and it's also not useful, but it is neat for discovery.
I can tell you how it's useful if you like, Hogtie.
Well, before we do, just Hogtie, just FYI, and I'm sorry I have to say this, but I actually had my headset muted for the last 10 minutes. Could you just repeat all of that for me?
Thank you, Nick.
Yes. The answer to that question is yes, I could.
Okay, never mind. Okay, that was it. Sorry, Simos. I really regret cutting you off for a cheap joke. I'm not going to go there again.
I'm into cheap jokes, Nick. You're always welcome.
I know, but everybody here knows that I definitely could.
Okay, so because of that, exactly what you said, Cantor sets or whatever they're called. I don't really know the actual name of them in mathematics, but it's something that Alex Malpass said to a presuppositionalist. Was no, there's a third option, infinite regress. Right?
Oh, fuck, here we go.
Because, and then how do you start it? Well, you don't start it. That's the point about an infinite regress. But yet the number 32 does appear in a or -2 if you want to go for the infinite regress, or positive regress, does appear in that number or in that number line, however long it may or may not be. Right. So there is some sense. There's some sense that it's useful in terms of giving another option to the either God did it, or God accounts for it, or God doesn't. No, there's a third option, infinite regress.
Can I touch on that point? And then I do want to. I know there's other people here, so I do hope they're holding their thoughts and they're ready to say other things. But I do want to say, because this is coming up a bit about, I want to tie together the notion about usefulness, and then about how sometimes these concepts come up in conversations with precept. For some reason, we're mentioning precept. Nothing is useful in a conversation with a precept. It doesn't matter what you know, thought about. The history of contemplation of some of these really weird issues, because they don't get any of it. Just even in thinking about the show ahead of time, I was reminded of having a really ill-fated conversation I had with Matt Slick about when he was saying, hey, he's doing his typical precept. Well, how do you explain that? How do you explain, how do you explain love? How do you explain morality? How do you explain evil? Blah, 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 blah. And at one point he's like, well, numbers are real. Like how do you explain the fact that, that math works? Or you don't think math was just created in our heads? And I'm like, yeah, of course we invented math in our head. Well, how do you explain that 2 + 2 = 4? And I said, well, it doesn't, right? So you imagine how this if you're actually a mathematical fictionalist, and you meet with somebody who's not put any thought into these philosophical issues. And they just began and ended on that intuition that math must be something real. And they want you to explain that thing that is nothing more than an ill thought out misunderstanding on their part. But they will put you to the defense of a position that you don't hold if you're a fictionalist. And then you tell them, well, no, I can't defend this idea that numbers exist without a God because I don't believe in numbers. Then they're just like, oh, you must hate God and love your sin to take that position. Come on.
Yeah, I get what you're saying, Floyd. You're bound to have something to say on this. I know you, Floyd.
Well, I'm not sure if we want to wrap up or not, or you just want me to talk about presuppositionalism.
I do want to wrap up, so you can either take it now or say something and then finish with something else if you want.
Yeah.
Whichever you prefer.
Yeah, I mean, presuppositionalists, I'll just reiterate what Hogtie says, that they have a very shallow, especially Matt Slick. Matt Slick has a very shallow understanding, if not a misconception, of all these concepts. I think he even misrepresents his Calvinism. I think he's one of the poor apologists when it comes to philosophy. But I guess just to wrap up, this whole debate of whether is math do mathematics really exist, or do numbers really exist? Are mathematical objects real, and so forth. This debate has been going on for centuries and centuries. It's still being debated among philosophers today. I think I think Hogtie brought up a good example of how imaginary numbers are actually useful. Where before it's like, oh, that's an interesting quirk that the square root of -1. Oh, it's kind of confuses us there about it, but who cares? It's we're not going to use it, but we actually are using it with quantum mechanics. So I think we need to keep an open mind. I don't think this is the end of the story. I think this debate's going to keep on going on and on, and don't close your mind. There's always more to learn and always more to discover, and so again, I don't think this is the end of the story at all.
Thank you. Headless, over to you, sir. Did you enjoy the show? And if not, is there anything you could contribute to saying why not? And if you did, is there anything you want to end up on, whether you think discovered or invented may not be the right question, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm going to go with it might not be the right question.
Thanks, Headless.
I want to say in support of his position, and I can't really call that he was a great title. We don't give a shit of his. I think that's actually a defensible position. It's probably the most pragmatic position to take on this philosophical issue. I mean, honestly, I was able to get through a lot of math stuff without really having a firm position on this: do numbers exist or not. You're learning the rules of the game, just like you're learning the rules of chess. And the don't give a shit of his position is probably the most defensible one if you're a human being with life.
Yeah. Oh, and just for Nick, the current king of France is Louis Alphonse de Bourbon.
He might be away at the moment.
Oh, he's away. Yeah, he's muted. Everyone now outside here in the chat knows.
Yeah,
there is a current.
I have put the link in the description below.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Who the King of France is. Thank you. Hillary, over to you, sir.
I'll just end where I began. I think that the principles are discovered, but that the language is invented.
Oh, I like that.
Interesting. The language is discovered. Yeah, I mean that does tie in exactly with what Hogsay was saying, that they're not necessarily exclusive, and so you fall down. It's a bad question. Thank you very much, Hillary. Piper.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think a lot of people said the things that I would say on the topic, so
Well, please repeat them just so we can hear your voice say it.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think I think Hogtie's point was about, you know, the usefulness being in spite of the fact that they're fictions is a good one. I mean, so, you know, if you are a fictionalist, you will think that mathematical propositions are strictly speaking false, right? Just like it's strictly speaking false that Peter Parker lives in New York, right? But that doesn't mean that, you know, nobody's ever learned anything from, you know, reading Spider-Man. It also doesn't mean that nobody's ever discovered anything from reading Spider-Man. You know, fictions can do a lot of interesting work to allow us to discover truths about the world and truths about ourselves, and you know, and allow for discovery, right? So, you know, I think the sort of position that I'd want to take about, you know, math is that it's that kind of thing. It's a fiction, but fiction is artistic, and so it allows us to learn a lot about things. So,
Okay, thank you so much. Cerberus?
I think math is an arrangement in the brain, and brains are real, so math is real.
Love it. Materialist to heart. Thank you so much. And concise as well. That's probably a much better argument than I was trying to go for as well, by the way. But nonetheless, we can address it again at some point. Nick, are you back yet? I'm going to take that as a no. Just before we leave, then, just to give Nick a bit of time to come back. Just quickly sort the rest of all the problems in the world out. No, quickly, could you just tell me whether you think all mathematical objects point to something in reality or not? Floyd?
No.
Thank you. That's quick. That is quick. I will give you that. Okay. Hogtie, for you?
None of them. Sorry, my answer was 3 times as long as Floyd's, but none of them.
None of them. Okay. Do they point to? Was the question, yeah? Okay, none of them it is. I'm not going to argue too much. Are you there now, Nick? Because if not, we're going to go to the outro anyway. Nope, we're going to the outro. Thank you, everybody. Big shout out to Xbox, of course, who hopefully will be with us again soon. We miss you, and please, I hope everything's good for you, and we will see everybody for next week's show, hopefully, on whatever subjects that the Onion decides to be. And yeah, I want to thank the panel, especially Hogtie, Floyd, Hilary, Nick, Cerberus, Piper, and Headless for being on the show, and anybody else who has joined us. Thank you very much, everybody in the side chat, and we will see you for next week's show, hopefully. Thank you very much.